Welcome, everyone, to our second half of Sexuality and the Sacred Self. We hope that you were able to join us last night. If not, you should have received the recording today to be able to catch up on our conversation that's being continued tonight. We had lots of great feedback from you in the evaluations, and we're going to try and get to a few of them tonight. But I just want to tell you that we are doing a follow-up webinar to this series on December 12th. It's Monday, December 12th, 6:30 to 8 p.m. Central Time. So you will be getting an email about that as well. There'll be a flyer that goes out as well. So thank you for coming. I just want to introduce, well, before that, I want to say, for those of you who weren't here last night and who were here last night, I want to remind you to just please take care of yourself. You are most important. Our primary goal tonight is to not cause more harm to you. So if you're having a hard time with the subject matter, or comments, that some of the presenters make, just feel free to walk away, to turn video off, get a breath of fresh air wherever you are, and, call a friend, get a drink of water, breathe deeply, and then come back if you feel like you can. So we just want to take care of you tonight. But let me just introduce you, our presenters to you tonight. We have Dr. Mark Lavand, is a sexuality educator and researcher working at the intersection of sexuality and Catholic theology. He is an AASECT certified sexuality educator and supervisor, training future sexuality educators through academic programs at Widener University and the Sexual Health Certificare program at the University of Michigan. As a part of his work, Dr. Lavand teaches human sexuality courses at various colleges and universities and conducts professional trainings to increase sensitivity towards sexual differences, self-reflective sexuality, and the intersection of sexuality, personal faith, and religion. In addition to sexuality courses, he teaches education methods, theology and religious studies, counseling sensitivity, and research methods. That was a mouthful. Okay. And then we have Gerard McGlone, who is a senior research fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. He is a survivor himself of clerical sexual abuse, adult sexual misconduct, and harassment. He has been clinical director and executive director of various treatment centers for religious and clergy in the United States. He is the author of numerous peer-reviewed articles, chapters, and 2 award-winning books, The Inner Life of Priests and To Be One in Christ, Intercultural Formation and Ministry. He has also authored several sexual abuse prevention programs in the church and religious orders. His new book, When Faith Grooms, will be published with Georgetown University Press. So we're so glad to have you back. We appreciate your time. It's valuable to us. So we're ready to listen. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. And it's a great honor for me to be back with an esteemed new colleague, Mark. I just am so impressed with the length, breadth, depth of the spirituality that undergirds your work. And that's so apparent in what we discussed last night and how we will respond tonight. We have some really amazing, wonderful questions that people left us with last night. And for those of you who did put in some questions that weren't answered last night, would you mind putting that in to the Q&A again? And again, in the Q&A feature there at the bottom, if you want it to be anonymous, that's fine, and just put that in again. And if you find out that, as we go along, you have another question, please feel free to do that. Tonight is really meant to answer the questions that you gave us last night so that you are really shaping tonight's presentation. You have given us enormous amount of material that we want to honor. We hopefully want to put some substance to, that we want to be able to answer as best we can. But we also realized in our conversations last night and today that we're not going to have enough time to finish all that you want us to talk about, which is really good news, that we've touched something very sacred. We've touched something very important for us to talk about as abuse survivors, as trauma survivors, and how to regain that sense of the sacred. How do we regain that sense of who we are and take back, what was robbed from us? And we're going to be talking more specifically about how did everything we talked about last night apply to those of us who are abuse survivors. And so that's the sort of goal for tonight. Again, please mark your calendars for December 12th. And we will post, if we could post now in the Q&A, Mark, the link to the evaluation form. We really do value your input. And we just, we're in awe of all that you said to us with the evaluation forms that we received yesterday. And so we'll be sending that to you now so you get to see it either in the Q&A or in the chat so that you can have a chance right away to, once you see it, you can go to the side there in the Zoom feature and you just press those little dotted lines there. And then what you do is then you can press it. And then what you can do is, just go to those lines to the right there. So you can click it and then press copy. And then you can download it into, send it yourself an email or just put it in a Word document so you can immediately access that. We really encourage you to do that quickly. Again, they're very simple questions. We don't want you to spend too much time on this. Just immediately sort of send in what it is that you, what was helpful, what wasn't helpful, and what would you like for our next webinar. Mark, any sense of introduction, any sense of what you want to frame tonight?
Yeah, sure thing, Jerry. Thanks. First of all, on the Q&A, if someone could ask for the eval in there, because I don't actually have the power to put anything in there until someone asks about it.
Actually, Mark, I just unlocked the chat.
Oh, great. All right, let me put this in here. All right.
Okay.
That should go. I'm wondering, did that get to everyone?
Yes.
It did not.
Yes. Didn't?
Oh, all right. No, I'm going to answer it here too. This is great. More places.
Okay.
There we go.
Terrific.
All right.
Terrific.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. To echo what Jerry and Paula said, everyone who came last night, you created a great space. You offered such great questions, and you helped really drive the night's conversation. And tonight is going to be more of that, more of you driving this conversation in a webinar format. Yeah, Paula.
Can I mention something? And I don't know if you mentioned it because I was looking to unlock the chat, but I wanted to mention that whatever is on the evaluations tonight and last night that we haven't gotten to will probably shape the follow-up in December. So
absolutely. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so really excited to be here tonight talking about, we'll start with a couple of the questions that Jerry mentioned. Jerry's going to kick us off doing that. And then if you have questions as we're talking or questions that you think about between last night and today that you want to ask and talk about, go ahead and put that in the Q&A. And then we can go from there. And Jerry, did you mention the anonymous? You can click anonymous and then allow people. Yeah.
So when you go to your Q&A, if you don't want us seeing your name, you can just, there's a feature there where you can become anonymous there. And that's one of the reasons why we decided to go in the webinar format tonight, as opposed to seeing, pages and pages of 50 or actually last night we had over 90 show up. That gets a little overwhelming in Zoom. So understand our concerns were really about how to make this manageable, but also how to really get to your questions as much as possible. So again, without further ado, one of the first questions that we received, which I thought was really so important, is how, what is healthy sexuality, and how do we begin to sort of look at that, in a sort of basic way. So Mark, I know you've done extensive work on this. You've edited volumes and articles answering this very question. So I'm going to defer that to you and then add whatever might be helpful after your sort of definition of how would you define healthy healthy sexuality.
Yeah. What is healthy sexuality, right? In the US, there's an organization called SIECUS, the Sexuality Information and Education Council of the United States. And they recently rebranded themselves to SIECUS, Sex Ed for Social Change. And in the early 2000s, they came up with a whole list of criteria for what constitutes being a sexually healthy adult. And it was a whole page of their standards, right? They have education standards for K to 12, sex ed, what people should know at what ages. And in an article I wrote last year with moral theologian Karen Ross at Marquette, I ended up summarizing that statement into a very long-winded and comma-spliced sentence. But it really boils down to how do we dialogue with our sexuality honestly in ways that we can integrate it into who we are and how we live our lives and communicate with others. And it's really a matter of being honest with ourselves and what's going on. Coming to the conversation about who we are sexually with, okay, this is what we have, this is who we are. How do we interact with ourselves and others honestly about that? Mm-hmm. And that integration process, it takes a long time, right? And part of that involves, when we have professional lives, we look to role models and we say, that's who I want to be like. When we have families and we're a mother, a brother, a father, and a sister, we say, I want to be like that person. But we don't oftentimes have a good sexually healthy role model. We don't oftentimes have someone we say, well, I want to be like that sexual person. And so without that role model, we don't oftentimes have experience or a schema, a way of understanding how to integrate our sexuality into who we are.
Wow.
And so being able to be patient with yourself and do that work.
Wow. Gosh, before literally hearing that definition for the first time, Mark, you had no idea of what I have done for the past 20 years in seminaries and houses of formation. And using those words of models was exactly what I would ask a seminarian. I would ask a seminarian or someone I was, in conversation with, so who was your model for healthy sexuality? And going back to what we talked about last night, all too often, we learned about sexuality through all those great experts on the basketball court, all those great experts in the alley, and all those great experts who have proven to be not so consistent in their expertise. So critically important then is to really ask that question. So who is your model when you think about healthy sexuality? And then I would ask them further, so now when you look around here with formators, when you look around here in the House of Formation or in seminaries, who is your model for healthy celibacy? And one of the key things we know, and I would refer to the saints saying, we do have models in the Catholic tradition of healthy celibacy and healthy sexuality, because we have just a panoply of expertise of lives of saints, in which we have those who were virgins and remained virgins and died as virgins often for the cause of sainthood and holiness. We also have the experience of St. Ignatius Loyola as a Jesuit, who had a conversion experience, even though he was incredibly sinful, and notably so, and in his own sort of admission. And yet he had this conversion and then told Jesuits to live like the angels in their idea of celibacy. Then you had an Augustine. And then you have all these other, saints who, had conversions and tried to live a healthy, holy life, but because of their own sexual proclivities and sexual compulsions, they sinned and failed and got up again. So again, it's really important in formation. It's really important in ordinary life of all of us that are not striving for celibacy, to look at who are the models I can look to, of healthy sexuality. One of the the models that an old supervisor said to me to look to old couples who still hold their hands when they go down the street, because they have weathered pain, hurt, conflict. They've gloried in love and joy and still are able to touch the sacredness in the other at old age. So to me, we have models right in front of us all the time who model holy touch, who model what does it mean to effectively communicate well, to confront well, to create safety, to create ways in which touch is ordinary, not extraordinary or odd or rare. And so to me, I think that modeling, Mark, that you point to is so important if we're to integrate it into a sacred sense of who we are.
And what do you do if you don't have a model like that in your life?
You're not supposed to ask difficult
Yeah.
questions.
Actually, I like this one because
I was thinking of asking you, Mark, to be my model.
well, thank you. Thank you. I like this because this is something I frequently thought about growing up. It's
Cool.
like, okay, well then I don't understand. So the reason I got a PhD in human sexuality studies is because there was a lot that I really didn't understand. And so I'm like, I really don't understand all this sexuality stuff. Like, okay, who do I know that like does this right? Who does it well? And I'm looking around and I don't really see anyone. No. And then, and then I see in the world of sexuality studies, all these people who are open and out and talking about their sexuality and great conversations. And from that, I gained really important and necessary skills about what integration looks like. But still, they weren't, the best role models. Like there were still some things I want to do differently, right? Different conversations about ethics and values will come into play as we age, right? And so how do we, if we don't have a good sexual role model, what do we do? Well, this is a, 5-part day-long series, but in short, what we can do is first imagine what is it that we want out of ourselves in our sexual lives. What do we want to be like in 10 years, in 20 years, or in 1 year? Or I wish we were already, but I'm not yet, right? What do we do? What are those things? Go ahead and list those out. A sexually healthy me looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever that is for you. A sexually healthy me looks like, and then start talking about, well, how can I get there? What do I need? Right? From a sexuality education standpoint, first and foremost, we need education. From a Catholic morality standpoint, first and foremost, we need education. This is what Catholic moral theologian Richard Gula says, and he talks about as the categorical knowledge, right? The things that we just need to know, the basic nuts and bolts of any of your decisions. Because as another Catholic theologian, Bill Madison, says, if we can't see rightly, we can't judge rightly, right? So sexuality information, education, and research is really, really, really important for how do I want to be as a sexually healthy adult? Getting that information, knowing all that. And then what are my values? What do I want or not want around values in my sexual life? Do I want to cause harm to others? Most people say no. Good. What do I want that non-harm to look like? Right.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And of course, all the other things that go under that.
When you don't have a model for sexuality that is healthy, so my model of early sexuality was the abuser teaching me what love was, thinking that that was love for a long time. So I had to undo what was modeled to me in my thinking, in that distorted way of thinking, distorted way of being touched, in that distorted way of feeling. You know, and as we talked about last night, for me, and I think this is entree into the bigger topic that we're going to be getting into next, is what does all that we talked about last night mean for abuse survivors? We're going to spend a significant amount of time on that. I just want to give a personal witness to the fact that I did not have good models in my family. I did not have, and I certainly did not have a model for healthy sexuality because I was abused in high school and then in early formation. So it took a lot of hard work in therapy and in more safe friendships to create a healthier model. And I refused at a certain point, after, as many people know my story, I just refused to allow my abuser to have power over me anymore. And so I had to reclaim that process, which was not easy. It's extremely painful and extremely confusing. And I think what prompted my research on what was the difference between offending and non-offending Roman Catholic clergy, in my interviews with non-offending clergy, what we're seeing in the questions, what we saw last night and what we're seeing tonight are, each person is a unique mystery. And when you meet a person's sexual history, you meet a person's sexual history. The commonalities we talked about last night pale in comparison to what it means for the individual unique gift that God has created. But the hard work that abuse survivors have is precisely this issue of how do we take back what was sacred to us and gifted to us and reclaim that and not allow the distortions of mind, the distortions of emotion and heart, and the distortions of touch become normative. In other words, you know, as we're going to talk about, what we gave as a template, now we really need to get into the nitty-gritty of the hard work of what we have. But also, and this is time and time again, we see with children who, for example, escape trafficking, children who are, you know, in transit at the border, children who are fleeing abusive realities. They're fleeing because they have the resilience and innovation to get out and get away. So they already are healthy. And we refuse to think about that as abuse survivors, that our coping mechanisms have really saved us. Mm-hmm. And those coping mechanisms are what we're going to be talking about in the sense of how do you restore and how do you have a new model of healthy sexuality? I know any reaction from you, Paulo or Mark in regards.
You know, just that great point that, you know, we have to believe in our own strength to get to the point that we are sitting here tonight watching a webinar on sexuality. I mean, that takes a lot of courage and a lot of strength. And don't belittle that in you. You know, in all of us, we need to accept that and claim that strength. So thanks, Jerry.
No, absolutely.
Absolutely. You know, I once had a teacher it was a Tai Chi teacher. And I said, oh man, I really wish that I'd come here like years before. And he goes, well, I had a teacher once tell me you weren't ready,
Mhm.
but here you are now.
Yeah.
And I think that's really beautiful. Like, you
Mhm.
are exactly where you need to be, and wherever that is on a journey. So
Mm. Amen.
Yeah.
Thank you both. This is very powerful. I think the key question, so the first question that we answered from last night was, okay, what is healthy sexuality? The next question is really, what is all that we talked about last night? How does that relate to survivors and those who have been abused? And so how do we, sort of talk about that now, Mark, in the sense of, so what is it like for you as someone who's taught people to really help other individuals to educate about this? What are the basics of trauma-informed, perhaps, recovery, trauma-informed sexuality, trauma-informed sort of recovery might be the way I'm thinking about this right now.
yeah, some basics about trauma-informed recovery. Being gentle with yourself, first and foremost. Coming to yourself as someone you love and that you want to dialogue with is going to be really important. Doing personal work is much more difficult when we're fighting ourselves. Oh, you should be here. Oh, why are you doing that? I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I do. Those things might be common, and to approach with gentleness and patience. And, it's oftentimes in therapy. I'm glad you mentioned therapy, Jerry. Thank you for sharing. There's an organization called ASECT. Paula had mentioned it earlier. I'm an ASECT certified sexuality educator. There are also therapists as part of ASECT. That's the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. And they will certify sex therapists, and some of them will focus on sexual trauma. And having a therapist who specializes in sexual trauma and how that works in our bodies and brains can be really, really helpful to talk through some of these things that we might be feeling, that maybe we don't know why we're feeling, but we know we are, and all of these complex, all the complex emotions and feelings and words that come into the experience of sexual trauma. Having therapists who specialize in that is really important. If you've had, what's that?
Very important. I just want to emphasize that.
Yeah. And if you've had a bad therapist here or there, I am so sorry. That does happen, right? Someone once told me, what do you call a doctor who graduates at the bottom of their medical class? Doctor, because they graduated, right? Not every therapist's strength is trauma or sexuality. One of the things I do is I train therapists to deal with sexuality, matters of sexuality. And the unfortunate reality is that not all therapists think they need to know about sexuality. So they just do therapy with their own understanding of sexuality. And that can cause more harm than it can good. And I've had countless people tell me about some painful things that their therapists have said to them about sexuality because the therapist was ill-informed. And so ASECT, I'll put the link in the chat, has a find a professional around me. So you can see if there's any ASECT certified sexuality therapists in your area. And great people to talk to usually about these kinds of things when it comes to sexual trauma. And while I'm putting this in the chat, Jerry, can you remind me of the rest of the question that I think I forgot to answer?
Oh, absolutely, doctor. One of the key things that the comment from last night was, okay, that's all well and good about all knowing about the basics of sexuality, but what does it mean for couples who have a history of trauma? One may have a history of trauma, the other one may not. What does that mean in regards to, really for abuse survivors? What does sexuality then look like? And I think some of the basics of this that we talked about last night become even more important for trauma survivors and abuse survivors. It is not uncommon in our treatment and what I've seen in couples therapy, where I was a couples therapist for 20 years, Mark is doing this now. It is not uncommon that couples have secrets. Biggest secrets is abuse history. And one of the biggest ways that stays secret is because, as we talked about last night, is that an internal locus of control takes over when we are survivors of abuse. In other words, we have a hard time not blaming ourselves, where we blame ourselves for everything wrong in the external environment and therefore in our relationships. And it's really important work. If you want to go to a great resource, Trauma Recovery Associates out of Kalamazoo, Michigan, run by a Catholic priest who does great work. Ken Schmidt actually was part of a retreat we provided for priest survivors recently. He does phenomenal work, goes into parishes, has been to Africa to start groups in trauma recovery. Why is that important? Because as children, as young adults, when something bad happens in the environment, we don't think that we don't have the ability developmentally to distinguish us from the reality. And so we think that the bad thing was caused by me. And so to me, that's one of the first things we have to really look at. Secrecy, isolation, going to extreme behaviors in managing what we've numbed out from is typical of patterns of behavior that abuse survivors can get into. And they can get into that most especially in marital relationships and in relationships of significance as they're dating. In other words, communication is important, how you view yourself and others, seeking treatment as Mark said, how safe do you feel with your spouse or with your partner? Where's the level of trust? And is there that space to really talk about healthy and safe touch? So those are some of the points. Mark, do you want to explain more about that? Because I think this is really what we talked about yesterday, last night, and they're processing how to discuss this today. How does a couple manage this? I think is what the question is. How do you sort of regain a sense of healthy sexuality when there's been trauma, when you've been abused?
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. And in relationships, it's really important that we have conversations with our partners about things that we feel safe to open up to them about. It's kind of a habit in couples dynamics where we just assume something about our partner, then they assume something about us, then we never talk about it, and then it's 40 years later because we just kind of, we're just doing that same thing, right? Mm-hmm. Well, when we're on what one author, Wendy Maltz, calls a sexual healing journey, there's going to be construction signs. There's going to be bridges that are closed off and that then can be opened in another 6 months or a year or 2 years, like whatever. And so it's really good to be having to remain in conversation with our partners. Hey, this is how I'm feeling about this thing. I don't know what that means. I don't know how I'm feeling about it, but this is where we are right now. And then in 6 months, schedule a time to have a conversation again. Hey, this is how I'm feeling. And also, how are you feeling? What's going on for you in your sex life? Like, what would you like me to know? Right? Scheduling time to have conversations about our sexual likes and dislikes and what works for us in a sexual scenario can be really, really helpful. People aren't oftentimes told how to have those conversations, right? So there's some resources online. You can look up like how to have sexual communication. And then of course, if there's something that's too stressful and you might not be able to work through it with a partner, it can be helpful to have a sex therapist or a sex coach there with you, helping coach you through that conversation, or helping to supply a framework that, hey, this is what you can use to tell your loved one, this is how I feel about our sex life, and this is what I would like to be, to see differently, or where I would like to be, or how can we get there together? I don't know, right? But constantly having that check-in every, 3 times a year, every 6 months, whatever works for you, can be really, really important. Because when we're healing from sexual trauma, there are sometimes hidden things that will come up. There were surprises that may arise in that journey. And it's really good to have an understanding of what things could come up. And as such, there's a book called Sexual Healing Journey by Wendy Maltz, a sex therapist. And the Sexual Healing Journey is a book that kind of explains how sexual trauma may have impacted someone's life. And then it helps a reader walk through, what does healing from sexual trauma look like? What can it look like? And there's some helpful little like worksheets and stuff in the book as well. But if that's a route that feels comfortable, that is one way to go.
Wait, Mark, I can resonate with so many experiences.
Jerry, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
One of the things that it resonates tremendously is my work with couples in specifically in this regard is there was I think you may have actually said this to me, that people forget that true sexuality happens between the 2 ears, not between the 2 thighs. Didn't you introduce me to that saying?
That the brain is a powerful sexual organ.
There it is.
Mhm.
In other words, notice what I said before about my own recovery of my sexuality is it's the distorted beliefs about ourselves and others and who we are and our future that is the sine qua non of healthy cognitive behavioral therapy. Well, what does that mean in regards to trauma therapy? Well, it means that you have to spend time, first of all, what do you think about yourself as a sexual creature? And then maybe look at those automatic thoughts that come to you over a period of time in order to really come up with what is the distorted belief that I keep operating out of here. So you can't change something unless you know what's there. And so one of the things I often have done with therapy for years is that it takes time to, first of all, find out, what do I really think? So in other words, that you have these automatic thoughts, as we say in cognitive behavioral therapy, that then combine to form, like in a couple of weeks after you jot these things down for a couple of days, then what does it look like when you put them all together? What is it? I believe I am sexually, boom. And it's accumulation of observation, reflection, and attentiveness to who I am, which reverses the very thing that has caused problems often in sexual satisfaction and in couples feeling satisfied with one another, and most especially in couples feeling safe to reveal that information. So as I've talked to sex therapists and trauma therapists for years, the key thing we keep seeing is the inability to really face what I truly think about myself. That often is determining performance or lack of performance, or like or dislike. Seeing a question there, I just shut down, or I just don't, something I feel defective in me. Well, that clearly is a distorted belief about who you are. That's clearly not of God, first of all. So spiritually, notice what that's pulling you away from God, because how could you possibly think you're God's beloved if you somehow think that you're defective sexually? Secondarily, what it exposes is, for some reason, somewhere, you were modeled that this is the way you perceive yourself. And so, like I said, it takes a significant amount of investment of time in yourself that you think it's worth the time to really look at what you believe, so you can change what you do and how you feel about yourself. And the second key thing that trauma therapists constantly talk about is what we referred to last night, and we referred you to that YouTube video last night, is that oftentimes trauma survivors, because they may have experienced orgasm or they may have experienced some titillation in the rape experience or in the sexual assault or in being abused. And especially if I was a young man, that the perpetrator knew what young men's bodies were like. I mean, if anyone's been around a high school, you know that it's not necessarily devoid of testosterone. In other words, that developmentally, young men react out of control and with no volition. Well, perpetrators use that really well. It's like the research from David Finkelhuer at the University of New Hampshire in Crimes Against Children lab there. What he discovered is that children are manipulated by people they know, not the stranger, by the way, people they know, and they're lured into meeting these people because they're interested as adolescents in sexuality. And so the perpetrator knows how to use that interest against them. He also wrote recently, just released the other day, on the incidence of child abuse through the internet, which is an interesting citation I can send you all. Bottom line, the brain is the biggest sexual organ. And if you want to change how you engage with your spouse, how you engage in a more sacred, holy way, really look at the distorted, shame-based, guilt-based belief systems that often control how we feel and what we do.
Yeah.
Wow. Can't hear you, Jerry.
Oh yeah, you mean
Paula, sorry about that. Any reaction to that, Paula and Mark?
I can say, wow, all of this is so, what the two of you are talking about is so practical and helpful for abuse survivors. I really believe that that's what we want, is to know where to go, where do we begin, why we are the way we are, to know about, our bodies and our development and how that was used against us, in the sense of, so many times I've heard that in the confessional, if, a young person confessed a sexual sin, they were told to be more explicit and to explain it, and that's where the grooming started, with abusers who took advantage of that. And that's not the norm.
Right.
That's not the norm. And we thought it was. And, it was never, ever our fault,
Mm.
ever. I
That's
just
a
want
hard thing to
know.
break, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
That
Even
internal-
as adults, I'm a survivor as an adult, and, in 3 different instances in 3 different dioceses, and, to break that, and to overcome the extra level of shame that goes with that,
Oh,
that, people are constantly saying, they're thinking it, if they're not saying is, why don't you just walk away? And they don't understand the depth of the relationship between, the victim and the abuser, and the grooming, all of that.
which is
And more harm
Yeah.
takes place when that is stated, by parishioners, by other priests, whoever, family members, family members. There's so much harm that's caused by that. And we hear it, Jerry, in our support groups, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, thank you, Paula. And I think that dovetails nicely into one of the questions last night that we're going to get into in a bit once we hear from you, Mark. But, how do you heal from the abuse of power? And I think that's what this is really talking about, that, that people have to understand that those of us who were educated by priests and whether rightly or wrongly, I think wrongly, held them up in such high regard that, they had ultimate authority and power over our literal bodies. And so we have a double whammy in the Catholic sort of tradition to deal with the shame associated with what does it mean for us to have recovery as survivors. Secondarily, then the guilt that is endemic in most unhealthy perspectives of how sex and sexuality is a gift of God. And, how do we sort of, you really, heal from that guilt that really doesn't help us. Mark, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, sure thing, Jerry. First of all, thank you both for sharing. Really powerful stories and not uncommon theme of people exploiting others and exploiting people's lack of knowledge to take advantage of them, right? One of the really important aspects about sexuality education is that it is an abuse prevention strategy, right? And so when we don't have accurate, holistic sexuality education, we leave people in a lurch. We leave people in a place where they don't know things. And you know what? The best person who's going to tell me is going to be anyone who's open to talking to me about it. And those are not always the best people, as many people know. And when we have these conversations about abuse prevention and the way that sexuality knowledge can help decrease abuse, we then start to see, oh wait, actually having these conversations don't only have a measure of like knowing knowledge, increasing knowledge, but rather protecting people from exploitative conversations, exploitative experiences. And so in healing from abuse, when we have an abuse of power, there's something that was taken away from us. And to be clear, we live in a society that already frames sexuality in a way that we try to hide a lot of things from people. Okay, so we're already in a landscape that we remove power from others. For example, as a university professor, if a student tells me about some sexually coercive scenario that they'd experienced, but they say, but I don't want to tell anyone. I'm still figuring it out. I'm still working through it at my own pace. The university mandates that I have to take that information away from them, give it to the Title IX office, and then it's out of their power to do something about it. So we live in a society that takes people's power away pretty frequently. Okay. And when it comes to recovering from an abuse of power around sexuality, first and foremost, naming what happened, naming it and framing it for yourself. What is it that happened in this experience? And then getting more information. Okay, let's identify where I did not have power here, right? In order to judge rightly, we need to see rightly. And in this time, this is usually where people say, well, I could have done, well, I could have, well, I should have. But what happened is that you acted in the best interest that you could have, right? Many times in abusive scenarios, consent is not even part of the conversation, because consent can't be had when someone has control over someone and manipulates someone and forces them in a grooming capacity, right? People who groom are very used to taking all of the other social angles and then cornering someone into making a decision, and sometimes tricking them to think that decision was theirs, right? So recovering from an abuse of power involves naming what happened, identify where the power dynamics were. And there's a sex therapist by the name of Tina Sellers. And Tina Sellers wrote a book about sex, God, and the conservative church. And in it, she talks about healing from sexual trauma in religious settings by, name, frame, claim, name, aim, frame, and claim, right? So name what happened. Aim, what do I want? when I'm all said and done with this healing process, where do I want to be? Right? We talked about that a little bit.
Mhm.
Framing, what were some of the things about sexual health, about sexuality knowledge that are important to know about this situation, this scenario? Because in learning more things, we then exercise our own power in understanding. We can then reclaim power that was taken away from us in information that was maybe given to us in an inappropriate way, right? We get to go back and redo that. We get to go and search information for ourselves and then claim a new experience of our own sexuality, right? One that has our power spoken to, one that really upholds our power in this situation.
Really important distinctions. And that was one of the questions that you all had last night in regards to how do we sort of deal with and how do you heal from abuse of power. I think one of the prerequisites going into this is that abusive individuals, whether they're male or female, have a predilection for taking care or taking advantage of vulnerabilities. And so those of us who've been abused are often taken more advantage of because of just our own neurobiology isn't allowing us, and our brain is not firing to recognize signs of danger. And so that, when we look at the neurobiology of stress and child abuse and all the research that's coming out of that is, trauma does change the way our brains fire, and so to me, it's really important to understand our limitations, really important to follow through with what you're saying, Mark, in the more basic sense of how knowledge is the best prevention. If I remember correctly, wasn't that the gist of your article in National Catholic Reporter after you attended the Fordham Conference, when you said it's no surprise to you that we have such a problem of sexual abusive behavior because of the lack of basic knowledge of sexual health within the Catholic framework. Did I get that correct?
Yes, you did get it correct, Jerry. So for those of you who don't know, I met Jerry actually at Fordham University when we were both at this sexual abuse prevention kind of conference. And I wrote a little piece about that conference in National Catholic Reporter at the end of April. And yeah, it's if we live in a culture and a community that refuses to talk about sexuality, it's no surprise that abuse is going to run rampant, right? Because if we don't have a model for how do we talk about sexuality healthily, then of course, then this fear of, oh no, talking about sexuality leads to bad things. That's a very popular fear, and that is not true. Talking about sexuality in coercive, manipulative, and abusive ways does lead to bad things. But there are ways that we can talk about sexuality in healthy and boundaried ways and developmentally appropriate ways that can really stop a lot of normalized abusive behavior, right? I want to point our attention to one of the things in the chat someone had mentioned about being at a Jesuit university and a classmate who's a priest was sexually harassing them. A lot of sexual harassment is information that is usually tolerated by our society as those are just jokes. That's just how that person is, right? But if we have a healthy, developmentally appropriate sexuality education, we then get to say, hey, I hear that, but that's not how you talk to people. That can make them feel uncomfortable, right? But until we name that, we just have this narrative that, boys will be boys. And that's a helpful narrative for no one.
Exactly.
Right. But also I want to name to the person in the chat, I'm so sorry that's happening. And you're absolutely right. When universities mandate reporting, it is not trauma informed. They take away the power from the person who wanted to talk about the experience. And I'm so sorry that's happening to you.
Right.
And that you are forced to have little options.
Exactly. And it leads, I think, naturally. Paula, did you want to respond to anything that Mark just said?
No, I'm fine.
One of the things I think it naturally leads into, which was one of the questions that came out last night, is grooming abuse. We know that canon law, by the way, has changed on this issue, that use of internet pornography, according to canon law, especially with minors, is grooming. So therefore it's a delict, therefore it's a crime. Let me be really clear. When my perpetrator was making sure that I would come by his office to spend special time, when my perpetrator took me out drinking when I was underage, to have special time, when he would hug me in it, for a long time, for periods of time without my, really knowing what was going on, with special time. That grooming had an end in and of itself that expressed itself, very soon after I entered the Jesuits. So was that grooming abuse? Damn right it was. Let me be really clear, really clear. The grooming behavior is a setup for more active behavior, but it is an abusive behavior. Sounds duped, without question. Let's understand that. And that happens in adult relationships, in the misuse of power that I think you were talking about, Paula. But we really need to be explicitly clear. And now the church is finally recognizing it as such, and beginning to explore what does a vulnerable adult really mean. I think there's confusion now in canon law with that, but when an individual is in a counseling situation or confessional with a priest, whether they are 5 or 55, they are in an unequal power position. Therefore, they can be easily taken care of and taken advantage of, rather, as opposed to being taken care of pastorally. And that's the difference. When you have an unequal power imbalance, it is always important and incumbent upon those with the power to exercise that in a responsible way. Any other exercise of that is abuse.
Even if you were an adult.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because, this is the training I've done for the past 22 years, that priest is never, ever not in a position of power. And he's a public power figure. The double, reality, that he has to represent the church in a public way and is always in a position of power, and so let's understand that rather clearly, and that has to be without exception, understood in that sense. Any observations on grooming, Paula or Mark?
Just another way to look at that would be, who has the boundary here? Who has the boundary in that relationship, and who crossed the line?
Exactly. Exactly.
I mean, I think it's pretty clear. And yet I know, 1 or 2 survivors that still blame themselves, still that say that they were complicit, because they were adults and, and they enjoyed it or whatever. It doesn't matter. It is not their fault. They did not cross the boundary.
And notice what it is, Paul. I think those distorted beliefs, that person might need help changing.
Right.
Might need help really. But notice what it is somehow it's my fault, especially in a power imbalance. Notice what it is. That it's an immature, and very Catholic immature sort of framework, that I am subservient, I'm less than this man ontologically, so therefore, I am less than. Well, what's our image of less than in a Catholic environment? That's an unhealthy theology of child and children, that we revert back to that which we were trained in. And it's an incredibly dysfunctional way of thinking about ourselves. And really the work in therapy is about gaining a spiritual maturity, regaining the sense of the sacred and healing that, but also then gaining a theological and pastoral sense of equality, that I am by right of baptism equal to anyone in the clergy state. Where did we learn that in school? We
Yeah.
didn't. But that's our theology.
Mhm.
That's our theology. Mark,
And
would you-
that's what the insidiousness of the grooming, how wrong it is, the grooming itself, and how abusive it is. It's insidious. And it's very, what's the word I'm looking for? Can't think of the word. It's just happens almost naturally. I can't think of the word, but
that's the
you
word.
know.
It's slippery.
yeah, that's a good one.
It starts with that little extra time after everyone else has left the office, and oh gee, let's go down, or
Exactly.
let's share a donut, or let's share a Georgetown cupcake, or
Mhm.
which is by the way right down the
Right.
hall.
Yeah, yeah.
Famous Georgetown cupcakes. But again, all of these sort of seeming acts of interest and care and concern that are really manipulating the relationship in a wrong direction. But
Mhm.
there's what I call slip. At the regular time everyone else stops, but you have to, as a special coffee together, all
Mhm.
that whole crap.
Right.
Hey, Jerry, what do you call them? For me, you kind of froze. I call them a
Slippery boundaries.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
I know the word I was thinking of is subtle. It's so subtle
Yes.
that you have no idea that's happening.
Yes. Yes. That's what I call predatory groomer.
Mm-hmm.
They were intentional and consistent. And in other words, they knew what they wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And they did all of those sort of subtle boundary violations.
Yeah. And, in this conversation about grooming and groomers, especially after trauma, one of the tendencies we sometimes have is what we call the monstification or demonization of someone who do bad things. And this is important, right? It's an important dynamic, right? We want to say that these people are like bad and terrible and monsters. And one of the things I do from a theological standpoint is that I see how that framework can sometimes lead to the perpetuation of violence then against people who are abusers, right? And that, theologically for me can sometimes be not the best. And so one of the ways that I like to reframe that is that these are people, when people abuse, there's something about their understanding of how this interaction is okay that is broken, right? And that they are a broken individual. I believe there's some statement out there, I don't remember who said it, but hurt people hurt people. Right? And from the sex research literature, what we find is the more desperate someone gets, the more apt they're going to take a sexual risk. Right? And if someone is hurt and then they cause harm to others, there's a sense of brokenness there that I personally take pity on. But again, no excuse for the harm that they cause, and that they should definitely be stopped and prevented in many and every way. But to think, theologically, that there is definitely some prayer we can offer to people who cause harm, and hope to think that I hope something in you is healed that prevents you from causing further harm to people. Right?
There it is. If I may, Mark, I think what you've described, I've worked at treatment centers for years and worked at Johns Hopkins when I first graduated from graduate school. What is clear to me is what the church has gotten right, in the sense of that it's so difficult for abusers to really think they did anything wrong. And so notice what it comes back to is the belief system that they really didn't think that they did anything wrong. As a matter of fact, when I confronted my abuser, I wanted to go into a reconciliation service with him and session with him. But he literally, I was told he was ready for this, but he was totally not ready for it.
Mm.
And so he literally said, I did nothing wrong. I taught you how to love.
Mhm.
That distortion is classic of most offenders I've treated and the offender I confronted. In other words, that why they need to be removed and put into treatment or supervised on a regular basis is because it's so difficult to change that belief system.
Right.
And notice what they do, we inherit that challenge to change our belief system,
Mhm.
but we're not perpetrators.
Jerry, that's why we can't achieve restorative justice many times, most often, because both parties have to be willing to own it.
Amen.
And that's why it's so difficult, not only because many of the perpetrators are already deceased, but because they want, I've witnessed a couple of sessions, of so-called restorative justice. And, it didn't work.
Yeah.
It didn't work. So I talk more about, because it's in my title too, Outreach Coordinator for Restorative Justice. And I gear more towards restorative practices, which is, these presentations, relationships with victim survivors, that's the restorative practices,
Wow, what a beautiful, beautiful image. And again, it's just the reality. I wish it were different, trust me.
So do I.
I mean, I've worked with umpteen different perpetrators, and I can count those who got it and realize they had done harm. Now, that's very different than what we see in restorative justice practices, where in death row, where you see these amazing conversions of someone who murdered somebody and is absolutely repentant, absolutely sees their punishment as justified, and want to die, as opposed to what we've seen, where so many of us don't want the death penalty because we believe and hope for for the perpetrators. Don't we? That's our belief in our spirituality. And so to me, this is really critical.
I'm sorry. We did have a presenter about 2 years ago who was a therapist for sex offenders who were mandated by the courts to be there. And he was telling me that it takes anywhere, and they have to meet certain criteria. And the first one is to own it. And it takes 2 to 7 years for them to get to that point, if they do it all.
Absolutely. I think some of the other questions, if I may, before we go to new questions that are popping up, one of the questions I want to clarify, there was a question about what I was referring to in regards to how parents become the first teachers of how to be touched and touch. How we talked about yesterday, how much sexuality really comes out of the family bond. The ability of a child to attach. Our own attachment styles come from how well we were parented or not parented, and what we saw and what we felt in regards to being touched. That I love that term, skin hunger. I've never heard of that before till I met Mark in April. And I think it so aptly describes people's penchants. When you meet someone, oh, I'm a hugger, you meet these people, it's like, well, maybe not, And so how touch is important. That analogy and what I was talking about is for anybody, in whether they're heterosexual or homosexual or have a same-sex attraction. One of the myths that the person was saying was oftentimes that reality of how critical parents are in the development of touch and in helping someone in their own sexual growth and formation of sexual identity is often used in this analogy that somehow homosexuals really come from the fact that there's a distant father and a very enmeshed close mother. And I took that question to an expert today. Mark and I talked about that, and there's just no support for that myth in the field of psychology and in sexual theories today. It's just not there. There are lots of, as the expert I saw it today said, there's a lot of people who had a very distant, father and enmeshed mother who are straight, happily married men. So again, that scenario doesn't create and is not appropriate with understanding our current understandings of heterosexuality and homosexuality, which leads into the other question that we didn't get to, Mark, in the sense of when we talk about sexual identity and formation of sexual identity, there's a question that said, well, what we knew about in 1971 seems to have changed dramatically from what we know about 2022 and the next couple of generations. Should we expect our knowledge to change in the same leaps and bounds?
Absolutely. One of the wonderful things, sorry, you're getting me on my soapbox, Jerry. I love sexual history, the history of sexuality. And it's just so amazing that our society over the last several hundred years has operated very specifically around sexuality, right? Alfred Kinsey, people in history, they have a lot of different feelings about which sex researchers did what kinds of things. Research-wise, his methods were problematic, but the point about Alfred Kinsey is that he was an entomologist. He studied bugs. And the university professor comes up to him and says, I need you to teach a marriage course. And he goes, I'm sorry, I'm a biologist. I teach about bugs. And he goes, marriage course. And he's like, bugs. And they're like, it's sex. You need to teach them about sex, right? People don't know about sex, so you need to teach them. And he's like, okay, well, let me see what we have on sex that's out there. And it was surprisingly little, right? And that was in the 1940s. And just prior to that, we've had all these outrageous theories about that someone who is gay and someone who's transgender and someone who is what is termed cross-dresser, right? There was this concept that all those people were just the same thing because it was a woman secretly inhabiting a man somewhere, right? That was literally a theory up until the 40s, right? And then that means that homosexuality, quote unquote, was a diagnosis, a mental disorder until 1974, right? And then it doesn't go away, it just hides in the DSM until 1987, right? So like, I don't know about you, a little age disclosure, I was born in 87.
That's a shock. I'm sorry. I'm not.
Right. What were you doing in 87?
I got ordained in 87.
Well, congratulations. I was taking my first breaths and you were taking your first breaths as a new priest. Thank you, Jerry. Anyways, the point is, this is not that far removed from where we are, right? Why did we have all of this like huge influx of information? Well, because we studied it. We now have protocol and ethical protocol to study these things about humans. And we are learning so much, right? In the 1980s, 1981, I think was in the comment, like, we now understand the actual anatomy of the clitoris that we did not know until 1992.
No,
like we just didn't know. Why? Because there wasn't the study of the clitoris in the way that it is today. We weren't asking those questions.
And isn't that a whole field of ethics in medicine now in regards to how few studies have really concentrated upon women and female, sexuality? And isn't it amazing too? Isn't that the whole problem with this contraception debate is, it's like, where's the pill for the man? Is that relevant in medicine? It's just how prejudicial.
Oh, absolutely. Actually, they had a shot for men. It was a cottonseed shot called Gossipol. And men, it was an effective birth control that would reduce the sperm count for men. But it was seen as too invasive for men to have to go to the hospital every month to get a shot. So it did not consist, right? And so then to interrogate that, what are the questions about our understandings of men and women and what's okay to do with men, or excuse me, what's okay to do with women as test subjects, but not men, right? Now we have ethics and research ethics to go about that. But still in the field of research is our assumptions, right? Our epistemology, our way of gaining knowledge. What are we assuming in your research design? Right? Really, really important questions. And I'm glad you bring that up, Jerry, because like, for example, we see that the statistics around sexual assault are that women are sexually assaulted significantly more than men. And then when you look at the sexual assault literature and the way that the scales and the measures were developed, it actually doesn't ask very particular questions about how men are sexually assaulted.
Yes.
Right. It was actually just 2 years ago. What year is it? 4 years ago that a researcher said, hey, the way that we ask men about sexual assault is not represented in our current measures. We should change that. We should ask different questions. And guess what, Jerry? When we ask the right questions, we see that men are actually assaulted at a rising rate. Is that actually a rising rate? Or is it that we're asking the right question?
Bingo.
Can you give an example, Mark?
Yeah, one of the examples of the
froze.
question. What's that?
You froze, Paula. Go ahead.
Sorry, Paula.
That question mark. Paula's
Yeah. One example of a question is, were you? There you are, Paula.
You were frozen. Okay.
There.
Yeah,
Okay.
no,
Now we're all here.
Actually, Paula, you were, but we don't want to get.
Oh, okay.
You know what? We all freeze
This
at
is
our
the
own
perfect
time.
sort of therapeutic encounter. No, it was you. Actually, no, it was your.
Don't worry. We all freeze it. But an
Technology
example
gets us with these things. But go ahead. Sorry.
right. An example of one of those questions is, were you forcibly penetrated? And people can answer yes or no to that. But one of the ways that men or people with penises are assaulted is that they are forced to penetrate someone else. Oh. And if we don't ask that question, then we don't have a way of accurately gaining data.
Interesting.
Right. And so that has woven its way into our legal structures and our legal definitions. Right. This is why the concept of marital rape didn't exist until the 80s. Right. Because we weren't asking the right questions with an appropriate frame. And now that we have a whole vocabulary and a way of dialoguing about this, you can bet your buttons that the things that we're going to understand about sexuality in the next 20, 40, 50 years is going to be different than what we have now.
Boy, now you took a long time to come back to answer that question, but that
it's the academia,
but it was a brilliant journey. It was just a brilliant journey. There was another question from yesterday that I think you need to clarify in regards to sexual identity. And you said there were 24 or 26 different types.
Yeah, 29.
29 different types of sexual identity or birth.
Yeah, no, pause on that. So yesterday we talked about sexual identity and how there are many factors that make up our sexual identity, right? Our sexual orientation, who we're attracted to, our gender identity. And then one of the things is our sex assigned at birth, or what people may call biological sex or sex traits. Usually people say, oh, biological sex, that's you're either male or female. And then now people are like, well, or you're intersex, right? And being male and female calls for a lot of things to fall into the correct box, right? Hormones, gonads, chromosomes, right? And make sure that those are all in one particular form. Well, what we find is actually that in intersex conditions, we have 27 different intersex conditions. And that means with male and female, and then 27 different intersex conditions. That means we have 29 different sexes that are currently recorded in humans.
In other words, these people were born with this reality. So let's
Correct.
be clear. We're not advocating for, anything other than this is just what's there, folks. And I think that sort of blew my mind when I studied at Hopkins. I was like, oh my gosh, when you are exposed to the range and the diversity of how people are born into certain phenomena, it just sort of blew away all of my conceptions about who a human person is.
Right.
Wonderful.
And Jerry,
final points on this.
oh, sorry, what's that?
No, any other final points on that?
Yes, final point. There's a great YouTube video about, I think BuzzFeed does it. It's like talking to an intersex person, right? And there's one person on there, long hair, very feminine, and she says, yes, and I have testes, right? Testicles. Now, to imagine a person like that going through the world and hearing people around her say things like, men, with their testicles, their testosterone, this is what makes them do that. And that person might be like, weird, because I have those and I have that level of hormone, but I'm not doing those things, right? How does that influence one's experience of gender and one's sexual identity, right? It does. And so there's just a lot of different layers that people oftentimes don't think about there.
Exactly. Paula, any reaction to that or any input from that?
No, I'm just listening and learning.
Right.
To me, what this really gets at, and really then coming back to what was talked about were some of the questions from you all from last night. I think we've gone through a lot of them, and I hope you find this is really just practically helpful in regards to the journey we're all on as sexual creatures, first of all, but also as creatures who have particular histories. And I think a trauma history or abuse history is pretty amazing reality when you look at it within the Catholic tradition. I think one of the comments that I wanted to come back to is that in our talking about abusers and the problems with abusers and the sort of cognitive sort of inabilities that they might have, does not justify in any way, shape, or form the criminal activity that was hidden by those in leadership. And let's condemn that again. That in other words, what we discovered in the McCarrick scandal, I think, was a complete indictment of the ways in which religious superiors and the ways in which bishops were complicitous in hiding that behavior, but even more in the Pennsylvania grand jury report, and now what we're seeing in several notorious cases still to this day, whether it's the Pulitzer Prize winning bishop from East Timor who was removed in 2000 and then suddenly removed again, whether it's the recent bishop in France, whether it's several different stories that are unfolding still in Portugal and in other parts of the world. What critics are clearly identifying are the systemic ways in which individuals in authority have protected the institution as opposed to giving voice to survivors and survivors' experience. That is immoral, unethical, and against the gospel of that we all believe in. Let us be clear about that. That if we are to have true change, then I think, as one author I read today, we need to get our leaders to stop thinking like abusers. That sort of cognitive framework in which the welfare of the order, the welfare of the church comes first before the welfare of the child, the woman, the man who comes before you and has been criminally assaulted.
Right.
So I just wanted to respond to one of those questions there. Any reactions, Mark or Paula, to that? Because I don't want to confuse our trying to understand what is with justifying any of the horrible ways in which our leaders or any church community, faith community have responded in just quite frankly, unconscionable, immoral, unethical ways.
Mm.
Any reactions, Mark or Paula?
I am waiting for the bishops as a group and as individuals to start washing the feet of the victim survivors.
Oh, wow. What a
I'm just waiting for that. We're all called to wash the feet of the one who's standing in front of us.
Amen.
And the victim survivors are standing in front of them and they want to push them aside. And it's their responsibility to get down and wash their feet and to embrace them and come to them and say, what can I do to change things?
Beautiful.
So,
Thank you, Paula. What a beautiful way to talk about healing traumatized sexuality.
mm,
There it is. The other image that comes to me is they also need to get out of the church and go to the side of the road where the survivor is beaten down and left for nothing. Because the majority of survivors aren't coming to us. The majority of survivors are still on the side of the road, beaten down, and they have left the church because they have no faith in the church. Mark, any other words of wisdom, any other insights with this that you would like to talk about, or give people with a key takeaway from our conversations last night or tonight?
Well, you are right where you need to be. And you're all doing exactly what you need to be doing right now in your healing, in your existing as humans, right? We all exist here and it's a messy thing, right? Existing in the world doesn't usually go as planned. But whatever that is and wherever that has led us to now, you're doing the best you can. Being here, sharing this space with us, sharing this time with us, sharing what you've shared with us. Thank you so much. And if you're sitting there like, I didn't share anything, that's all right. You being here, you listening, you thinking about yourself today was a great step for you. So thank you all for being here. Really, really appreciate it.
well said, Mark. Thank you.
Beautiful, Mark.
Just to encourage you again, please fill out the evaluations because, this is the first time we're doing something like this. We need to hear from you. We need to hear what your suggestions are, what your critiques are. Please, please fill out the evaluation for us so that we can do this again for others. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula, for organizing this. And it's been a great collaboration between Georgetown and the Archdiocese of Minneapolis-St. Paul. Just a friendly reminder, folks, stay tuned for the next evening in December 12th. And more than anything else, know how much you are the beloved of God. And that is our birthright.
Yeah.
That is our birthright, that we are God's beloved. And I hope these 2 evenings have really not questioned our faith, but most especially empowered us to be love for one another,
Right.
because we have to see as God sees. And we most of all have to see ourselves as God sees us. Well,
And I want to thank both Jerry and Mark for sharing themselves with us, so much of themselves. And they really did a great job. I wish we could all applaud you right now. You really did. You just were so complimentary to each other. So thank you so much and bless you. Bless everyone. Have a good night.